Hi.
The commissioner is in the room. We can start in 2 minutes.
No problem. How you doing?
Good, good.
Where are you now?
I am in Jaffa, currently in some sort of lockdown.
Okay. Worst place in the world to be.
Indeed. Can we rename you the commissioner of Jewish communal basketball to, compare you to Adam Silver?
I don't know. I'm not a big basketball fan.
Fair enough.
Sorry to disappoint.
Yeah. Okay.
I couldn't do the brackets this year. Just felt like if the NCAA tournament isn't happening, then the Jewish communal tournament doesn't happen either.
Should we just start now, 1 minute early?
No.
All right, I'm going to start recording in 3, 2.
I think you're gonna wait. I think you're gonna wait till 9 so people are here.
Sure enough. Fair enough. Yeah, Facebook is glitching, so we're on YouTube. What can you do?
Yeah. Oh, Dan Brown's here. That's nice.
Okay, I got 9 o'clock. You got 9 o'clock?
Ready to roll. Do you want people to mute, turn off videos? What do you want?
I would ask for people to mute. We'll try and leave 30 minutes for questions. So people will be invited to participate in the latter 30 minutes.
Great.
All right, so I'm recording. Welcome to our live discussion with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and author of an article that I found very compelling, so much so that I asked Yehuda to discuss it for our group and for the broader social media community. And we'll get into the role of social media during the pandemic a little later. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Eliyahu Friedman. I'm an alumni of several programs of the Hartman Institute, currently living in Jaffa, where I would say that we are adapting to a new situation pretty smoothly, and my confidence level, at least, is very high in the makeshift government and with our health officials. And I wanted to get the conversation started by asking you, Yehuda, a 3-part question. Number 1, how are you right now? Number 2, what's your emotional pulse and of your community? And thirdly, what would your message be to communities outside of the tri-state area that are hopefully preventing the sort of outbreak that the New York City area is now witnessing?
So first of all, good morning or good afternoon by you. Thanks for the invitation to talk to you today and to be with this group in exploring these issues. How am I today? Unrelated to COVID-19, I threw out my back, so I'm trying to find a way to sit comfortably. Listen, we, like everybody else, are deep into the various adaptations that all of us have pivoted into as a result of this crisis. Since we have a kid in SAR Academy, we're in week 5 of distance learning, and I'm also my spouse is the head of a school, so I have a front row seat to not just children adapting and to this new reality, but also watching an institutional leader, not only myself but my spouse, trying to figure out how to pivot an institution in a moment like this. I have felt since the beginning an enormous amount of personal privilege enough room in our home, steady incomes, not a lot of special needs that for our family. And as a result, compared to a huge percentage of the population, we are not in as desperate of a need for the kind of social safety net to take care of our basic needs. So it's hard for me to complain. And then in the context of my home and friends, everybody's struggling a little bit. So there is just this social isolation thing is challenging. And I think you're right to point out that because our community has been hit a little faster and first relative to the rest of North American communities and especially Jewish communities, that we have a little bit more wisdom. I've been really impressed with the leadership of our school at SAR and Stephanie's school, Beit Rabban, for the not only the speed through which these institutions pivoted, but the open communication they've had. We could talk about that a little bit more. I think the relative advantage of having experienced this change a week or two before others is going to dissipate pretty fast when this becomes a 3 or 4 month process. So right now it feels like 5 weeks of distance learning versus 2 weeks of distance learning feels like huge. But I think that after Pesach, when this is the new normal for the remainder of the academic year, I think we're going to all start realizing that those relative advantages have gone away.
Thank you. I think you may have answered a little bit, but as a follow-up, I was looking to clarify, when did the news of this pandemic first enter your horizon? Was it before SAR? When did you first grasp the scale of the crisis? And as a result, as an institutional leader, what were the first decisions? What were your priorities when you first realized not only is this a new reality, but oh my gosh, the scale of this is huge?
So our family actually went on vacation in the middle of February, and I remember we were traveled overseas. I remember being handed a little card at passport control that said something like, "If you've been to China, please let us know." And at the time, I was like, "Oh, that's a little odd." I heard that about the story of this emerging from China, but it hadn't kind of registered what a significant disruption it was going to be on all of our lives. I think and then obviously in our community, I guess the week after the APAC conference was when it was first starting to hit through originally in New Rochelle, but New Rochelle constitutes a significant percentage of the same community, school community and shul community as us in Riverdale. And so it started moving real fast in that week after the APAC conference. And for our institution, the first milestone decision in which we realized that we were connected to something enormous was that we were meant to run a major conference on Sunday, March 8th in New York on Jewish values and American democracy, and about the Jewish community in the midst of a contentious primary season at the time. It almost feels like nostalgic back to the days of a contentious primary. That seems like months ago. It was actually just 3 weeks ago. And because remember, all of the candidates dropped out in that same week, basically. And we made a decision, I think on the Thursday or the Friday before the conference, to cancel. And in retrospect, it was absolutely the right decision. There was a lot of anxiety among our participants, many of whom are in the dangerous age bracket. There was anxiety among our hosts about the conference. And I suspect in retrospect, a lot of people would still have come, and it might have been an event that would have facilitated a faster spread of the coronavirus. And so in retrospect, I think it was the right decision to do it, even though I think the conference would have been successful. But that was the moment where for our organization, it was like, okay, this is actually a big deal. This is not rumors of something. This is not, something that can be held and isolated in New Rochelle. This is going to implicate our institution on a much more significant way. I don't think when I look back to that moment that I fully grasped how drastic the shutdown was going to be, how significant the shelter in place phenomenon would be. I don't think I did. I think I probably felt like, okay, well, we're going to have to scale back some of our commitments over the next month. At the same time, we We canceled our travel schedule for staff and faculty around the country. We canceled trips from Israel from our faculty as well. So we knew it was going to be a significant pause, but I would not have at the time been able to say, yeah, we're heading for a full shutdown of the in-person work of our organization. And all of that, as we all know, cascaded quite quickly.
Right, right. In that vein of the shifting consciousness, so much has changed in a week. Your article was published only 1 week ago, and there are many important points we could get into. Assuming that some of the people who are watching this live or recorded have not read the article, what would you say were the main points that you wanted to get across? And what I was going to say, has anything shifted? But I'm sure something has shifted in the past 7 days that perhaps if you were to add or subtract one of the points, what would that be?
So the crux of my argument was as follows: that the American Jewish community has moved away from collective organizing, collective mobilization over the past basically 2 generations. If you go back to the middle of the 20th century, when the Jewish community, actually in many ways the organized American Jewish institutional infrastructure was created, there are all sorts of historic reasons connected to American assimilation to America, as well as the Holocaust, the birth of the State of Israel, a set of processes that created a consolidated, powerful communal infrastructure that was really capable of responding to shared needs. In the span of the last 2 generations, we have seen, I wouldn't call it a full dismantling of that infrastructure. We still have some strong central organizations on a local level and some on a national level, but we've seen a whole bunch of sociological demographic changes in the American Jewish community. In some ways, the success of the assimilation project. And as a result, our capacity at collective mobilization has significantly been reduced. Hold on 1 second. I'm just gonna tell a kid who's walking through here. No, I'm just on a live webinar, okay? Just letting you know. Sorry, I don't have a home office. So what I argued in the piece is that this is the moment for the American Jewish community to re-engage with the process of collective mobilization. Now's the time. We have an urgent epidemiological need to solve for something, but more than that, we have an impending economic crisis on the heels of the epidemiological crisis that's going to require us to make real prioritization choices about how to hold together our community. And I argued for a 3-step process. One is massive philanthropic mobilization to help the most vulnerable. And the Jewish community should be out front, both with respect to the most vulnerable of our own communities, but also with respect to issues like public health. Second, we have to support Jewish institutions right now from making drastic choices that are going to result from a loss of significant revenue to Jewish communal organizations that depend on revenue. And the third, and that's what I hope we get into a little bit later, we have to be prepared for a totally different Jewish communal map in the wake of this economic crisis, and we should be working with greater intentionality towards addressing that. And the last point that I made in the article, which was the one that I got the most pushback from some of my friends and colleagues about, was to argue that there are some collective needs also that are a little bit more specific, including an investment in American democracy. That it's not merely supporting Jewish institutions as a collective project for their own sake, but it's also investing in some larger commitments that we as a Jewish community realize are of kind of existential need for all of us. And one of them, which we've kind of let atrophy for a little bit of time, has been American democracy itself. What I would say is that I think American Jews very much care about our own values within the framework of American democracy, but we, like many other Americans, have lost a little bit of our commitment to the broader civic project, which is not about being right. It's actually about having an infrastructure that takes care of everybody. What has shifted? So first of all, we've already seen a number of Jewish institutions, especially those that are dependent on earned revenue, experience exactly what could be expected. The Philadelphia JCC was the first that got reported on this, that laid off or furloughed 176 out of its 178 employees. I've heard that also in a number of other JCCs around the country. There are a number of other institutions like that, Hillel's and others, that are facing some similar types of very difficult choices. And it's not clear whether they will be able to reopen at the same level once they get the earned revenue back through membership afterwards, or whether some of these decisions are existential. Now they're going to be out of business. And there are a few other institutions that were hovering around the kind of month to month income. Tenement Museum is another good example, are probably going to kind of be pushed over the brink in moments like this to shut down indefinitely. In some ways, right now, if you're an earned income revenue organization, you are most vulnerable right now, but you have a pathway after the coronavirus crisis to reopen. Whereas if you are dependent on philanthropy, you're a little less vulnerable right now. But if you were vulnerable to begin with, it's not crazy that that this could kind of push organizations off the edge. So number one, in the span of a week, one of the big changes has been that this process has in fact accelerated as we could have expected. A second development, which I would call a net positive, is that a number of the things that I pushed for in this article have happened, not because I pushed for them, but because other people were already working on that agenda at the time that I wrote it. So, and there are really a number of bright spots in a few major cities. In San Francisco, the Jewish Family and Children's Service; in New York City, UJA Federation of New York, have actually stepped up in a significant way for agenda item number one, dealing with poverty, trying to repair the social safety net, both again on behalf, both for Jews who are suffering, but also for the Jewish community to care about the social safety net more broadly, as well as for issue number two, which is help Jewish institutions to weather this moment. There have been some really positive developments. Jewish Federations of North America has led the mobilization effort to help Jewish organizations access the funds of the Small Business Administration loan program that came out as part of the stimulus package. In some cases, some organizations what they merely need right now are loan dollars to help them weather the next 3 months that they could replace when the economy restarts. In some cases, we expect that those loans are going to be forgiven anyway. So there's been a good process of collective mobilization around phases 1 and 2. And needless to say, you are a data point to this, but all of our other schools are as well. We've also watched the Jewish community rapidly digitize in ways that would have been unexpected 6 months ago. So a lot of that has happened really, really fast. The thing that I think lingers is agenda item number 3 of how do we do the work around preparedness for what our community looks like in the wake of the coronavirus crisis. And I think that work has not yet started in earnest.
Wow, lot to chew on there. I want to continue with a follow-up before we get into the Jewish communal map and preparedness in the wake of the medium to long-term future, although it'd be hard to clarify what's the short and what's the medium long-term. Every day feels like a very long time. But as an institutional leader, I'm wondering how basically no institution by definition's mission, unless you're a FEMA, is dealing with pandemics, right? So I would suggest that our institutions were caught a little bit off guard, like all of us pretty much were. And I'm wondering, how does an institution think about their own needs, assuming they have the privilege to not worry about shutting their doors?
Yeah.
How do they look past their own needs and their own mission to contribute towards the direct need right now, such as poverty? Or I personally think that the scale of the tragedy, lowering the number of healthcare workers who are going to potentially get sick and the number of fatalities, and also the Jewish problem that strikes me in the core is the disruption to our traditional way of grief and mourning. Now, that's not necessarily in your institution's mission, dealing with digital grief and mourning, but as a human being, every institution must be thinking, how can we maybe go beyond our mission while not overextending ourselves?
Yeah, yes. So let me try to speak personally about my own institution, but instead of talking about others. So it's on one of the central tragedies of institutions in general is that institutions get created to solve for a particular mission. They have goals, they have needs that they need to address, and anthropologically, we as human beings create institutions to solve for those needs. We mobilize resources that way. We mobilize people that way. We create infrastructure that can enable us to address those needs and challenges in a much more significant way than if we treated them ad hoc. One of the tragedies of institutions is that almost by definition, the minute an institution actually gets created to solve for a particular need, the institution's mission changes overnight to protect the institution. And that's a good summary of some of our worst institutions that have stopped serving their mission and instead believe that their job is to continue to support and sustain the institution. Even though rationally, you and I would say, if you're not serving the mission anymore, why do I need the institution? Right? But that's the kind of vicious process that happens in institutional life. In a moment like this, I think every institution is basically asking itself three questions. One is the purest question is, how might my institution continue to serve its mission in the world? And as you're alluding to, make sure that that mission is actually right now really important. If your mission is not that important, you might say, okay, how do I weather this crisis in order to be able to get back to my work? But the harder question is, I'm trying to do something powerful in the world, and the circumstances in which the world has presented are making that work different and maybe more urgent. And now I have to pivot the work of my institution to really serve its mission. A second question that institutions are going to be asking right now, ours as well, is, and I think it's down the hierarchy, is how do I take care of my people? Because ultimately our institutions are made up of people. Now, serving and taking care of your people is not the same as doing the mission of the institution, because again, that it can be perverse. On a human level, you want to make sure that people's salaries are paid, but ultimately, if the institution has outlived its value, continuing to drive public dollars towards people's salaries is not actually in the public interest. And the third question that institutions are asking right now is, how do I make sure my institution can survive? Now, in practice, I think most institutional leaders are starting from, how do I make sure my institution survives? So my colleague, Rabbi Joanna Samuels, wrote about this, indicting the Met and Harvard University for being institutions with massive billion-dollar endowments, multi-billion-dollar endowments, whose first instinct was to protect the institution by laying off and furloughing their workers. That's thinking first about the institutional health. Why would I want to cut my endowment? Why wouldn't I just wait it out at the cost of my people? And that's failure to account for one of your responsibilities is taking care of your people. And it's certainly failing to acknowledge that one of your missions is doing something noble in the world. But I think those are the three pieces of work that institutional leaders are navigating right now. For us at Hartman, I told this to my team explicitly in a note this past week. Our work is in the realm of ideas. We are not a public health agency. We're not even doing the work of the pastoral you alluded to grief and mourning right now. But we support leaders, rabbis, Hillel directors, lay people, etc., in trying to articulate a Judaism of thickness and meaning that can stand up to serious challenges. That's what we want to do in the world. The crucible we're in right now is, if we don't figure out what to say and to say really important things in moments like this, when the Jewish people are actually, and the human beings are actually in crisis, then we present ourselves as a luxury item, right? And if you're a luxury item, you obviously are not going to be big on anyone's priority list right now, but you might not be that valuable in the long run, except when the Jewish community has the luxury to afford it. So we have to determine, is the Torah, are the ideas coming out of the Hartman Institute right now capable of serving the needs of our mission and our people? And I believe they can be. That's why I spent time on this article, right? Because I actually think this kind of work actually can matter. Ideas do matter. Community mobilization matters. Supporting leaders in moments like this really matters. It's the single biggest variable on institutional capacity to survive crisis is the quality of our leadership. So I think this work is really important. So that's how I'm trying to think about what does it mean to take care of our institutional needs, is to actually focus on how do I make my institution fundamentally valuable. On a second level, we are obviously trying to take care of our people. And as a result, my colleague, Rachel Jacoby Rosenfield, with whom I partner in running the organization, has taken a very powerful lead as almost a pastoral voice inside our organization, supporting all of the human beings. We are ultimately an organization whose main commodity is human beings, trying to care for and protect those individual human beings, as well as to motivate them to be the organization right now. And we are obviously asking a whole bunch of questions, perhaps a little less publicly, around how do we ensure that our organization withstands the economic downturn? How do we ensure that our donor base doesn't disappear, that where we have limited earned income revenue, that remains intact? I think, again, the most noble way to do it is start with the institution's goals. But inevitably, I think in the real life calculus of institutional leadership, you see yourself juggling between those three pieces all the time: saving the institution, pursuing your mission, and taking care of your people.
Mm-hmm. Just a follow up on that. I suppose a synagogue, a dwindling attendance, its main asset might be the capital. Do you think it would be possible, a sort of act of altruism for such a community to essentially sell its main asset, its capital, in order to, financially contribute towards the great need at this moment? Or is that sort of not really within the realm of possibility?
So you're kind of getting at that third priority that I put in the article, which is how do we design for the post-coronavirus Jewish community?
Yeah. Let's just
And
go there.
yeah, and you're kind of alluding to one possibility, which is that does this crisis accelerate the going out of business process for a number of organizations that have outlived their value? And you're asking an even more opportunistic question, which is, if you know you're going out of business, how do you salvage those resources and help other organizations in their emergence? I like the way you're thinking. I wish that we saw more institutions think that way, who were able to say, I could probably get by for another 4 or 5 years, but I won't. But I won't go beyond that. And why don't I just take my capital and send it over to another institution that's thriving, or accelerate a process of mergers and acquisitions in the Jewish community? I think this is urgent and badly overdue. I've been pushing on this agenda for a long time. I wrote a piece on this a couple of years ago on how to reorganize the conservative movement on this basis. I published it in Medium, called Recentralizing the Center. How do we accelerate that process? Unfortunately, as we know, institutions don't think in those terms, because there's a prevailing culture that to go out of business is to fail. And in Jewish communal life, what that reflects is our belief inside each of our own individual institutions that we are the totality of what the Jewish community is and needs. That's the failure of collective thinking. If you are a collective, you could imagine a situation in which this organization grows and this organization diminishes, but the community is intact because it just needs different institutions at different times. That could be a way to envision what community looks like. Sally, I'm online on a webinar right now. I can't do that right now. Sorry. I could imagine you could imagine a community collectively, if you have a Kihila structure that says, okay, your synagogue or your JCC has outlived its value, and now I'm going to take its resources and allocate it to someone else. Problem is, we don't have the governance infrastructure that even where there is strong centralized collective leadership, we don't have the governance infrastructure wherein synagogue X yields its autonomy to some structure that says, okay, I'm now taking your land and I'm giving it to the thriving minion down the street because it actually needs it. I think there are a few ideas on how we could actually make this happen. The first is a very significant mergers and acquisitions. Hold on one second, I'm sorry.
So,
You gotta finish, sweetie, because everybody can hear you. A really significant mergers and acquisitions fund in the Jewish community. One of the reasons why mergers and acquisitions don't happen is primarily because of fear of loss. If I merge with another institution, I'll disappear. But it's also because there is very little revenue out there to make that process fluid. If institutions felt they could serve their mission with a different infrastructure, acquiring another organization and so forth, that kind of body of money, I think, would make a big difference in a moment like this. You know, the money number on this is that in the last 30 years, 40% of conservative synagogues closed down. And it's astonishing to think about how many of those closures could have resulted in the reallocating of real estate resources and other resources to actually strengthen the movement. But absent a really strong infrastructure that pushes people to make those decisions, it's not going to happen on its own. So if you need some financial resources to bring that about, and you need peer pressure, you need a system that is thinking of itself as much more of a collective. And how to get there, I'm not sure. The other hard question, and I've spent the last kind of 2 weeks thinking about this, is if there are going to be a hard set of decisions for what does the Jewish community look like after this change, who makes those decisions? And I think that we talked about this on our Identity Crisis podcast this week with Hindi Pupko from UJA Federation, with Andres Spokojny from Jewish Funders Network. The fear, I think, is that because money is a very significant force of power in the Jewish community, that the funders are ultimately going to wind up making decisions about what the community needs that might be for the community, but not as much with the voices of the community. But I think the big question right now is, if we want to imagine what does the Jewish community look like after this crisis, it's not just a question of what does it look like, it's also who's involved in the decision-making process, because there's going to be winners and losers.
right. So we have reached our halfway point. I will ask my first question to open the floor, and then those who are on Zoom can think about their question. Maybe this can work smoothly. If you can chat, you can just send me a heads up so that I can call on you so we don't have confusion. So I'm going to put two questions into one. When we talk about the new Jewish communal landscape, I'm guessing there are those who are bullish on the prospect of the newfound spring of internet services, internet learning, anything digital. Those who are more pessimistic about how quickly are people going to want to return to physical gathering when this is all over. My personal idea, thinking right now, is that we have a Facebook group called Jew Book University, which has 13,000 college students that are there for sort of like fun, dating, memes activity. And I want these 13,000 college students, many of whom presumably have needed technical skills, all of whom theoretically can pick up a phone and call someone who is lonely. I want someone to be coordinating this massive goodwill, essentially. And my own website, all I had to do was post for someone with web skills, and immediately we had a team of about 10 experienced developers building us a website for the pastoral need. And I believe that it's not necessarily the same people who are used to the traditional way of philanthropy who are most tech savvy or Facebook savvy. And this is, I believe, only accelerating the fusion of digital and religion, etc. So when you think about the new, both now and looking forward, the role of social media, you're of course very well known for your lengthy Facebook posts and treating Facebook seriously. I'm wondering what you think the social media masses can do to work together with this emergency task force, with your institution, etc.
Yeah. So I think you're right that there's some interesting new possibilities that are emerging when when educational institutions like ours, like universities, like day schools, uh, are seeing that the work is possible, not ideal, but possible. What ways it accelerates processes that should have been much faster until now. I think that's good, and I think there will be aspects of this that linger. We have already said to ourselves inside an institution, I right now am in the midst of the longest stretch in my time at Hartman not traveling during the academic year. It's pretty good. I like not traveling. And it started to raise questions for us internally of, not being in, X classroom in Detroit or San Francisco is probably not as good. But is it 75% not as good, 25% not as good? And how much of that is worth saying, okay, that's a worthwhile sacrifice for us to reduce costs, reduce our environmental footprint, achieve our educational objectives, et cetera. So I think that process is accelerating. And I think you're right, it's exciting. How do we also mobilize intergenerational talent, as propos your comment? If you have people who actually know how to use these technologies, how could we create more powerful bridges across the generations? I would say there are two dark underbellies. The first is um, a little bit of an indictment of what we don't do when we should do it. So one of my examples, and I wrote in the article, was about BIMBOM. BIMBOM was a small organization originally called Godcast that was using animation and video technology for years to pioneer this kind of work in Jewish education. And they were a sub $1 million annual budget and couldn't raise it. And it's one of these things of like, you go back to FEMA, like, okay, now we're pivoting into the emergency services, but wouldn't it be great if we actually were able to think about these kind of investments as infrastructure investments? And again, you need a philanthropic infrastructure that sees itself as responsible for the unsexy building of infrastructure, as opposed to fund programs, in order to bring that about. The second underbelly is that not everybody's being served by these media. If you are a student with any sort of special needs in a classroom right now in Jewish schools, and I know this firsthand, both from people I know and people working in the field, kids are just falling behind very, very badly. And there's just no time or resources to deal with that problem. If you have any sort of learning challenges, these media are actually much worse, especially because there's a kind of homogenization of everybody into two dimensions on screens. And so I'm not sure that everybody will benefit from this kind of stuff. And needless to say, there's no comparison between in-person Shiva and digital Shiva. What that means, though, is that we should be prepared for two things with respect to the digitalization of Judaism at the end of this process. One is, where are the places where we can create gains, as you said, small incremental changes in which we move much faster down the process of use of new technologies for the improvement of Jewish life. And I think we should be prepared for a really significant bounce back. When people start realizing, I had kind of emotional moment with one of my classes that I teach to a group of learners in California. And I travel a lot, so I actually see them quite a bit. And I've learned with them about a couple times a year for 10 years. And really smart, really, really intelligent, capable group of people. And at the end of the class that I gave them 2 weeks ago on Zoom, one of the people said, all this time I thought I was coming for the intellectual encounter, but I wasn't. I was coming to be in person with all of you. So I think we should be prepared to put all of this digital stuff in context, that it pales as a human experience to real deep human relationships. And I expect we're going to see a pretty significant bounce back of, yeah, I probably could use Zoom more effectively and more intelligently for my organization, but it is not what my organization exists in the world to do.
Interesting. I would just maybe push back a little bit that perhaps there's a generational shift with the comfort for which teenagers today are using their screens, that synagogue on a screen may be more of a seamless transition than those of us who even my generation obviously grew up attending in person. And we'll see. Moshe asks, In your article, you call for centralizing the American Jewish community. Is there a way to centralize Jewish community, prioritize needs, and allocate funds accordingly on a global scale? He adds, as the largest, strongest Jewish community in the world, what role does Israel have to play in the rehabilitation of Jewish communal structures worldwide?
So let me make a distinction here between calling for centralization versus calling for collective mobilization. It's an important distinction. Centralization is to say we should all essentially become one much more powerfully organized Jewish community. Collective mobilization feels to me like a temporary verb. There's a project that we can do together. It is possible that the result of that project would be a more centralized Jewish community. But my guess is that because there are a lot of skeptics about centralizing the Jewish community, a lot of folks who may have felt over the years marginalized by centralizing organizations, a lot of folks who feel held back by what happens when you have to work in concert with other institutions, who would be resistant to collective mobilization because they feared that it results inevitably in centralization. Now, it's possible that the consequence of collective mobilization would be more centralization, but I don't think that's the goal. That's why I tried to articulate, here are a couple of goalposts we can set up. This is one $250 million project. This is $1.5 billion project, which are reachable for the organized Jewish community. We certainly have the wealth in the Jewish community to get there. Only, last statistic I saw, only 7% of Jewish philanthropic dollars go towards the Jewish community. If you increase that number from 7% to 11%, you'd have all the money you could possibly need in Jewish life. So the money is there. We just need targets, goalposts, destinations for us to do that kind of collective mobilization work. Now, in terms of the follow-up to that, what happens for the rest of world Jewry? So Moshe, it's an interesting question, because I actually think when it relates to the rest of world Jewry, this is the one place where collective mobilization and centralization of the Jewish community still exists and is actually pretty successful. Organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee do this, and that is what is a $350 million annual budget, which is primarily directed, if I'm not mistaken, towards Jews in Israel, FSU, in Europe, in other Jewish communities as well. I think part of the core question of the article was, we would probably do this for another world Jewish community that we watched crumbling. If it was in Krakow, if it was in Argentina. I think if we saw that the only problem that those communities had right now was an influx of resources, I think there are the philanthropists, the organizations, JFNA is another example, that have people on the ground, have knowledge, and have the reach in the philanthropic community to actually mobilize and help and support them. I think for some reason we fear doing it for our own community. I guess I'm not totally responding to your question, because I'm flipping it. I'm saying, yeah, I think American Jews would do that for another Jewish community that was in crisis. The harder question right now is whether we'd be willing to do it for ourselves.
Is there anyone on Zoom that has a question? And the role of Israel. Moshe has a follow-up. I would add there have been several reports that have come out on EJP. I saw Reut had a report yesterday about the impact of Jewish philanthropy. Obviously, Israel has many organizations that are interconnected with an American or a global economic recession. I'm wondering what you're already hearing from your partner in the Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel, the scale of the tragedy. Does it feel like it's worse in Israel? It still hasn't come to Israel yet. We just don't know. When will the Israeli border reopen? What is the ripple effect of Passover being canceled effectively?
From what I read in the news and speak to my colleagues, New York is way ahead and way worse right now than Israel. And I think the biggest differentiator, and again, this was something we spoke about in the podcast a couple of weeks ago with Daniel Hartman, the biggest differentiator between these societies is our political leadership. Like your political leadership or not, Israel has experienced mobilizing a collective consciousness when it comes to existential crises. and has done so more effectively, some communities more than others. And as a result, I anticipate it will get worse in Israel, but it's hard to imagine it will get as bad as what's going on right now in New York, where there are literally makeshift hospitals being set up in Central Park. And enormous confusion between the federal government, state government, and local government, which is exacerbating the problem. In terms of Israel participating in the kind of global Jewish philanthropic economy and the extent to which this work, this problem hits Israeli organizations. So you will see, I think, phase 2 of the philanthropic crisis if it reaches that. And keep in mind that when we talk about a philanthropic crisis, there are 2 phases. The first right now is that urgent funds are being directed towards urgent needs, and it's not clear whether those philanthropic dollars will therefore be available to hold up the Jewish communal economy. And the second crisis is if the market remains down, then the corpus of Jewish philanthropy is down. In other words, even if a major foundation has $1 billion in the bank, as opposed to $1.5 billion, that's a lot of dollars that get peeled off of the endowment interests that are not going into the same institutions anymore. I think that, no question, the Israeli nonprofit economy is going to suffer, especially from phase 2. But that again will take 3 to 6 months at least to start seeing the results of. It's also hard for me to imagine that when there are such pressing needs in the American Jewish community for American Jewish institutions, that there will be like a lot of donor excitement to support equivalent institutional challenges in Israel. The good news for Israelis is that the overwhelming majority of the nonprofit NGO economy is held up by the Israeli government. The Israeli NGO system is much more closely tied to the overall country's economy. And the good news for Israelis is that there's a stronger social safety net. So you get fired by a JCC in Milwaukee, you lose your health insurance. That doesn't happen for Israelis. So I know that's like limited reassurance, but I do think that the consequences, while dire for the Israeli system, don't quite produce the same kinds of consequences on a human level as they do in the American Jewish community.
If anyone has a question, now would be the time. Otherwise, I'm going to suggest that we wrap up early and give you the gift of almost 15 minutes of unscheduled time, which I'm sure you can use. Perhaps give you the floor to wrap up our conversation, and thank you very much for taking the time today, and blessings to your community, to New York. For me, from Israel, I know we feel more of a dread for your experience in New York than anything that's happening here.
Yeah, I'll say just as a closing, there's a lot that is poetic and weird and dark about this moment. Among those elements is that diseases don't discriminate, right? So they remind us of fundamental human equality, but they do surface deep existing inequalities, right? A colleague of mine reminded me of Michal Biton was talking to me recently about a book called Heat Wave, the social autopsy of an environmental crisis. I think I got the title wrong, but that it's true that a virus like this doesn't discriminate among humans, but it does. Your social and economic and political position is going to dictate how you experience this loss. What that reminds us of is that our existing conditions are ripe for exploitation, even by things like an epidemiological crisis. So I think part of what we're exploring today, what we've been talking about, and what I've enjoyed hearing from so many people about this article, is that coronavirus does not create totally new challenges in Jewish life, but it does expose where we have challenges and limitations in our community. And the the real challenge for us collectively is to say, okay, it's like a magnifying glass to your problems. The equivalent is like coronavirus doesn't create structural poverty in New York, but it shouldn't surprise us to notice on the map that the communities most hit by the coronavirus crisis are those experiencing structural poverty. So these are moments for us to hold a magnifying glass to our community and say, okay, here are our challenges, and do we want to take responsibility and take care of them? Obviously, our first main responsibility is to the sick and to their families, and I hope that we have the fortitude to remember that they are the most important. And I think we have another big challenge coming up is to say, okay, we've now seen where are the limitations of what we can do as a community, and how do we want to remedy that? And coming up on Pesach, the holiday of Jewish collective, the creation of Jewish collective consciousness, I think there's a lot of work for us to do.
Thank you very much, and behatzlacha with everything. Hope to be in touch.
Thank you.